Welcome to the April 2020 NATS chat. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are going to be speaking about singing through the change, serving women through midlife, menopause, and beyond. And thank you, Joanne Bozeman, for being our guest tonight.
Really happy to be here. Thank you for asking me.
And I also, of course, although she needs no introduction, I've asked Peggy Baruti to join me as co-moderator, as an official of the Voice Foundation. So thank you, Peggy, for being here tonight.
Thank you, Corey. I love being here.
So, Joanne, let's start by, I know you didn't time this purposefully. We didn't schedule this chat to coincide with the launch of your book, but I think it's a wonderful, fortunate coincidence that it did. So why don't you hold up the book and show everyone? I'm sure most people already know about it.
Here it is.
Through change. So
right.
This is the project of Joanne, Cate Neely Frazier, and Nancy Boss. And I just want to say that Cate had hoped to be with us tonight, but as she's publicly acknowledged, she has a mild case of COVID-19 and is not able to be with us tonight. But we are thrilled to have Joanne here as a representative of all three authors. So Joanne, let's launch in on a, I'm so sorry, what's that?
I was just going to say, Cate is, hi Cate and Nancy. Cate's doing well. She just, has to take her time and heal up, and felt like it would be better if she just laid back tonight.
Yeah, well, we support that, that's for sure. It'll be interesting to watch these NATS chats and, 2 and 5 years from now, and, to reflect back on what was going on in the world with COVID-19. And although this isn't a special edition NATS chat, it still is occurring during the world being locked down. So very interesting time. But tonight we're going to turn our attention to something else. And let's just begin with talking about what led you and your co-authors into an interest on this topic.
I'll talk first about Cate, and then I'll talk a little bit about Nancy, and then end up with me. Cate had an interest when she was a young mother, and had thought about doing some research on it, but being busy and not having an attachment to an academic scene, it just didn't work out. But the interest was there when she was much younger. She did have a difficult time during her menopause, but it was complicated by other surgeries and other health issues. And then about 3 years ago, her interest rose again, and she did a presentation for the total voice, oh, I forgot what it's called. Anyway, total vocal freedom. There we go. She did a presentation on that, and Nancy Boss was watching that presentation and got interested because Nancy was closer to that perimenopausal time. Cate and I are well past it. So they started talking about doing a book together on this subject for singers, and not a medical book or something like that. They were working on it, and Nancy's interest is she's all about everybody being able to sing. That's her passion. She wants every person to have a situation where they can sing healthily. And then she discerned that some women were having some issues during this perimenopausal, menopausal phase, and sometimes stepped back from singing because they were uncomfortable. So that piqued her interest. And then I do remember 2 years ago being at the NATS convention and watching a session, master class, and Nancy slips up next to me and says, "Would you be interested in co-writing a book on menopause and voice?" Just out of the blue. I went, "What?" So I said, "Well, let's talk about it." And we did. And I'll dial back a little bit into my story before I give the answer. I've always been interested from when I was a young mother in female health, reproductive health, if you will. And after I had my first child, I became a childbirth educator. It was a pretty long, drawn-out process to be certified, but I played the role of a health educator and taught young parents about childbirth, prenatal, early parenting. And so I really enjoyed being in the role of taking medical information and putting it into sort of everyday terms for everyday people. And I did that for 10 years, along with teaching and singing. And then when I started teaching at Lawrence University, I had to drop that. But it's always been there. I was happily singing in my 40s, and when I hit about 47, my voice started doing really, really strange things. And I was a pretty well-educated person about female body, but this was perimenopause. I had all other symptoms, but this voice thing started happening, and that really, really took me by surprise. So long story short, it was a difficult road for me, and it was probably unusually difficult, I think, in my case for some reason, but eventually my voice stabilized and I began to sing with much more comfort and started doing some performing again. But anyway, so that's my story. But in the meantime, after that, when I would find women who wanted to talk about it, like you could just kind of tell, and I would say, tell me what's going on with your voice. I remember standing, Martha Elliott did a survey at NATS. I want to say it was about 6 years ago.
Mm.
And I took part in it. And then when she did her poster at the session, I talked to her, and women just wanted to talk about their voices at this time, and they felt like people didn't understand. They were confused. So I was in the interim, had an interest. And then, so back to Nancy at the NATS convention, she said, we want to tell stories. We want to do the book by telling women's stories. And that's where I bought in. Because everybody's experience is different, and you can't just melt it down to a graph or a statistic. It's about a lived experience through those years. And so when of course, we talked more about it and decided to go ahead with it. So that's where it started, almost about 2 years ago. 2 years ago, June.
I've heard you mention that the book actually took a different turn than you intended.
Yeah, it did. And I'll tell a story about, we did these interviews. We interviewed 53 women. If you put us in there, it was 56. Though we didn't really tell our stories in the book. But we interviewed these women, and it's a broad spectrum of singers. There is investigation of elite voice. Barbara Fox DeMaio, her dissertation is on elite singers, and she interviewed, I think it's like 19. She also interviewed voice teachers and singing voice specialists, voice rehabilitators. It's a great data for that population. But we decided we want to have average singers, some elite singers. We have a number of genres are represented in the book. So it's a broad spectrum, and we have people that are women that are perimenopause, menopause, and then a little bit into aging voice. And then as we started interviewing people and getting this data, I realized, this is a little untidy. It's a little hard to convey what is menopause, what is health, what is circumstance, life experiences that happen. And I was talking to an anthropology professor, a friend of mine, and I said that very thing, because this is qualitative research or qualitative project. And I said, this is kind of untidy. And she said, oh, absolutely. She said, narrative research is messy, and if it's not messy, I won't believe you. So that was kind of nice to hear, that it was okay if we couldn't really sew the seams real straight. And so once we did that, we realized, it's more than about potential hormonal changes in the voice. It's about other health changes that people encounter. It's about stress. It's about perseverance. It's about working with medical care people. In some cases, it's working with teachers. And all in all, these women showed remarkable tenacity and will to sing through some hard circumstances. And I can't stress this enough. We do have stories about women who didn't have any problems at all and can sing well and sing confidently and feel better about their voice than ever through this time. So not every woman struggles with voice changes during perimenopause and menopause. So we have those stories too.
And you talk very specifically about kind of 3 categories.
Right, and this hasn't been researched exactly, and I think it would be really nice if we could understand a little bit more. We tend to think about menopause as this, women say, I'm in menopause, and that's not a real specific way of looking at it. When we look at it medically speaking, perimenopause is the period of time leading up to the cessation of menstrual periods. That means fertility is waning down during this time. So peri means around menopause, and sometimes it's called premenopause, but we use perimenopause. At this time, your body is, it's like your body is going into a state of infertility. Menstrual periods become irregular. Hormones are fluctuating in a much less predictable cycle. Periods are changing. They're getting lighter. Sometimes they're getting heavier. They're spacing out. They're coming back together again. And then there are the other symptoms that go along with it that really surprise a lot of women. That, like in my case, along with my voice weirdness, I was waking up in the middle of the night soaked to the skin, and I would have, a pair of extra pajamas by the bed and towels, and it didn't occur to me that that was perimenopause. And other symptoms in retrospect, I go, oh, that's what that was, So, and each woman experiences it very differently, but because hormones they're hormone receptors all over our body. We tend to think of estrogen and progesterone and androgens as reproductive hormones, and they are, but they're way more than that. We have estrogen receptors in our brain, our skeleton, our muscles, as well as in the larynx, as we know. So that's why our bodies do strange things at this time when the hormones are rebalancing, changing, and I'm saying, okay, go back. So that's perimenopause. That can last 2 to 10 years in some cases. So that means a woman, if the average age of menopause is 51, which it is in the United States, you could start having some changes in your body when you're in your early 40s. If you go into menopause when you are in your late 40s, it can start in your 30s. So, not everybody starts that early. So it's a fairly long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's perimenopause. When your periods stop, utterly, and you have to wait a year counting to see if you have a period in that year. If you go 12 months without having a period, then you're technically in menopause. So reaching menopause is a point in time. But the first part is perimenopause. And then the other part we don't talk about a lot, but I think it's important with the voice, is that year. You don't know it was your last period until a year, right? But if it is, then that really signals the time when your fertility is basically turned off. Your ovaries are no longer secreting estrogen and progesterone. They do produce low levels of androgens, which is testosterone. Your body still will produce some estrogen, but in a lot lesser amounts. It's produced in actually fat. And so you do still have a little bit of estrogen, a little bit of progesterone, but the levels of estrogen and progesterone fall way off after that last period. Now that can have sudden effects on the voice. So in Martha Elliott's study that she did, a survey, it was interesting that I think it was 48% of the women said that they had voice symptoms that developed in that year, within a year. That tells us something about that sudden drop off of estrogen. And then, so when you hit that year, when periods have ceased, then you are in menopause. And that's a different physiologic status for your body. And some women find that their symptoms calm down at that time. We found a little bit of a pattern. I'm going to ask Peggy if she's noticed this as well, that some women have vocal instability in perimenopause, and it's kind of wacky, and it comes and goes. And we talked to women, and I certainly experienced this, saying I would sing, everything was the same, I breathe the same, think the same thoughts, and something would come out of my mouth that I didn't will. Kind of unpredictable, and it's frustrating. And the next day it might be a little bit different. So it's a very changeable thing. A friend of mine who's a voice researcher said it reminded him of his son's changing voice in adolescence. It was different every day a little bit. So,
and I would interject, I would just say one thing. It's not really surprising if we consider that when our periods are normal and there's hormonal fluctuation related to those periods, we experience impact on the voice. So when we go through perimenopausal and hormonal distribution, or the distribution of hormones is so irregular, can be, it's to be expected that you might have these unexplained conditions that don't relate to technique.
Right, and I think that's a really good point, Peggy, because I think that what we do when that's happening is we blame ourselves, and we think, oh, all of a sudden I've become a terrible singer, or the voice feels so strange. It feels like I remember saying, somebody's put a different larynx in my throat. This is not my voice anymore. And trying to deal with that, it was very challenging. So this is what I'd like to understand more, is this pattern of more instability in perimenopause as a possibility, then in some cases maybe a bit of worsening for some women at the last period, and the more sharp drop off of the hormones. Then we found, as we talked to people, that maybe a year or two into menopause, things stabilized. Now the voice is a different instrument at that point. You're subject to midlife aging, things that are going on. Your larynx probably has changed in composition because of changing hormones, loss of hormones, but it's not doing like this anymore. It's much more steady state. And it's almost easier for some people to deal with that and say, okay, now I can work with this voice. It's not changing all the time. And I'm speaking in generalities, and everybody is different, but that might be a pattern that could be looked at over a larger population.
And I want to make it clear that you found in discussing HRTs, hormone replacement therapy, that you actually didn't have many stories of women that chose HRTs, correct?
I think I went through and I looked at our statistics the best I could, and I think that out of the 56, I included us, it was I think 21 or so women took HRT.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, HT, and all of them liked it. They either had taken it before or they were on it presently.
Did you happen to know that to me is so interesting, and I'd love to know, did you happen to see a difference in the stories based on that one component as much as you could gather? Do you remember noticing that? I'm putting you on the spot a bit, but.
Right. I'm remembering more the women that started it within their story and said they could tell a difference, that it helped them.
Okay. And I want to talk a little bit about, generally you feel like there's a lack of information about the voice in general. Were you surprised as you started to do some research specifically of what's out there in our journals and our books?
There's good information. There are a lot of studies on they tend to be more about speaking voice, which has value, but it's so different from singing. The demands of singing on the voice than, conversational use of the voice. There are tendencies that just say that through this time, the speaking voice lowers, the fundamental speaking pitch lowers. Then that's pretty well established. Some studies show that women on HRT, it doesn't maybe go down as low. Some say yes, some say no, but I think I'm safe in saying the tendency is yes. With HRT, it doesn't go as low.
I would say one of the problems with that, I'll just interject, is I'm not sure there's really clear data on this, and it needs to be studied more and in a more effective way. I'm not sure that the information we have right now is as solid as it could be, even on the speaking voice. There is some, which is helpful, but you're absolutely right about not being nothing on the singing voice that's
very little. There are a handful of studies over maybe the late 90s. And of course, Abitbol did his study on 100 postmenopausal singers, and we have some results from that. That's probably the biggest study that I'm aware of. One one study was done in a dissertation by Dr. Cate Kessler-Price. Now, it's not a published study, but it's a huge one. 308 women, and she did pre, peri, and post. These are choral, some are avocational choral singers, and then some are more trained soloist types. So she has kind of two levels. She did look at HRT in that population. She did acoustic measures. She let's see, all the things she did. It was just a really wonderful study. Singers handicap index. They did that. They reported subjectively on their reaction. There's a great bunch of data in there.
I'll tell you that. Oh, sorry. Cate did type in that of the women who had no vocal issues and felt they had just gotten better and better, no one was taking HRTs, correct? Oh, she's asking a question, correct?
Oh, okay, let me think about this.
Of the women who had no vocal issues and felt they had just gotten better and better, no one was taking HRTs, correct?
Of the stories that I could zoom in on, I think one did not, one did not. Thank you. I need to like go through and.
Well, yeah, that's a lot to remember. 56
details.
People.
Because we're telling the story sort of narratively. We weren't exactly making a lot of statistics, but it's a great question. They all, I would say in that section, and we put them all in one chapter because we found it so interesting, they all sing regularly, and some sing a lot, particularly one I'm thinking of. Regular and variable singing. Two of them are voiceover people. They do voiceovers, they do recording stuff and live performing. So the voices are getting quite a bit of workout and doing quite well. And the other one, let's see, they all take care of their bodies. They're very conscious of their physical health, the way they eat, and they all have, it was an attitudinal thing, very positive. Now, I'm not saying that it's all there, but we did find that they had strong ideas about positivity, and it's not scientific, but that's what we found out in that bunch.
We're getting a couple questions. One, there were a few people that logged on a bit late. Would you hold up the book again so that we will at the end as well. But yes, there is a hard copy of the book available.
On Amazon. And I have to brag just a little bit. This illustration here is a piece of something that Cate Frazier-Neely did. That's a huge wall piece. I mean, we took a little bit off of that, and my son did the graphic design. So
that's wonderful. I love that. And just to remind our listeners, when we still will cover some things, but don't hesitate to ask questions. There's a question box, and you can just type the question. It goes just to me, and then I will ask Joanne the question on your behalf. We have one that I think this is a good time. During peri and menopause, this person is saying that they did not experience instability in their singing voice. It was afterwards when the challenge showed up, like a gap in the upper range, etc. So she's very interested in what happens during that phase, and is there any data?
So are we talking about like after menopause was established? Can you tell from the question?
It sounds like post. Sorry, it came in two different boxes, so I'm having to click back and forth. During peri and menopause, so I'm assuming it's for sure after the year.
Okay.
Yes.
That seems to be a pattern that, one of the things that women do complain about a lot is that loss of that upper range. And we don't know exactly why that happens. Peggy, do you have a feeling about that other than maybe the estrogen drop off? It just hasn't really been studied, but it's reported a lot.
I think we can make guesses based on what we know about hormones and physical strength and muscles and sort of neuromuscular activity. I mean, all of these systems are affected by menopause and by the cessation of these hormones. And because the instrument is so complex, it's not surprising. I mean, do we know exactly why the upper would necessarily be the harder part? I don't think we do, and I don't know that it's always true. I have to tell you, one of the things that I've seen that I think is fairly consistent in an aging voice is difficulty in a classical singer, is difficulty in the balance required in the middle voice, that very delicate balance in the midsection of the voice between C4 and C5. I have seen women go through menopause and retain their top or most of it, maybe not the very tippy top, but have more trouble with mixing than anything else. And I certainly think that's neuromuscular and just loss of muscle strength and firing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's interesting because I'm sorry, you know, what Peggy was talking about, it's, to me, there's two things we're talking about. That loss of, a lot of people can zing up to the top, they still have notes they can hit, but it's the ability to, and this is more of a classical singer thing, the ability to sustain a long high phrase gets in some cases challenging.
Well, we certainly know long-term the effects of aging, or the loss of hormones and aging. And like you say, it's multifactorial. We don't know exactly what's specifically hormonal and specifically aging. And I'm not sure we can really separate them.
Right.
I just want to thank you. I really appreciate what y'all have done in tackling this specific area and allowing women to tell their individual stories. This doesn't need to be scientific data. What most women need is to hear the voices of other singers who've gone through similar events. I think this is incredibly helpful, and also indicates where pilot studies should go. Gives us a lot of direction about things we need to look at. It doesn't have to be definitive in terms of why things happen, just that they do, and documenting that. I think it's an incredible service, and I want to thank you all for it.
And hopefully it'll help guide our doctors in treating, you know, women.
Absolutely.
You know, because
No, go ahead. Just what you said earlier about the lack of knowledge among singers and teachers about this whole event. And I think that speaks to the issue of knowledge in general for us as singers and singing teachers. Where does it come from? Where does state-of-the-art information, how does it get to us? And if we're not NAPS members and we're not reading the Journal of Singing every month, where does the average person get their information? I mean, this is a sort of endemic problem in our field, and I'm not sure what the answer is, but you sort of brought that broader issue into play.
Absolutely. You know, when I started looking at material for the book, and I had accumulated quite a number of journal articles in that early phase, and actually wrote an article for Classical Singer, and at the time I was in the midst of all this, and I wrote it with a pseudonym. I was not quite ready to out myself with all my students and everything. Quite kind of a funny story that I did. Because one of my effects was it was very difficult for me to sing in tune. I would hear a pitch in my head, sing it out, and it would just, it'd be flat. And it was kind of embarrassing, but I realized at that point I'd had, I guess, what you would call a diagnosis that a very fine voice doc said, you appear to have neuromuscular changes related to lowering estrogen. So I realized I needed to tell my students this, just come out with it. So after a studio class, I said, y'all stick around for a minute. I need to talk to you about something. And so they stayed, and I said, I just needed to let you know what's going on with my voice, and it's related to perimenopause, and it's not unhealthy. It's just going through some changes. And they were very sweet about it. And then a few girls came up afterwards and they cuddled around me and said, oh, Mrs. Bozeman, we thought you were going to tell us you're pregnant. So
that took a different direction than they anticipated.
No.
I love that. That's great, Joanne.
But I really do feel like that was a great teaching moment there.
Yeah,
that they
absolutely.
They understood that this can happen, and they were seeing it happen. Oh shoot, I digressed, and now I don't know. Oh, education, where to find the information. There's some wonderful things in like medical sites like Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins, Brigham and Young's, hospitals, and these kinds of facilities where you can learn a lot about menopause and perimenopause, breaking it down these days, and wonderful news reports on NPR about perimenopause and The Guardian and New York Times. So that's all wonderful, but they never talk about voice as a symptom. I found, I think, 4 websites in my looking that mention possible voice change with menopausal transition.
Well,
And,
we of
go
course
ahead.
have to mention Jean Abitbol. We can't have a conversation about this without mentioning his incredible work, both his original book, The Odyssey of the Voice, and then the book that came out about a year and a half ago called The Female Voice, and which I have not, for obvious reasons, had a chance to look at. But Joanne, I know you have looked at it. There must be some wonderful updated information in that book.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And he goes all the way back to fetal recognition of the mother's voice. And there's a lot of very interesting things in there. It's a good compilation of his research, absolutely.
Okay, so I'm gonna type that to the audience, the name, in case somebody's familiar with it's Jean Abitbol, a French laryngologist, The Female Voice, and then The Odyssey of the Voice. Gosh, that's got to be 1980s now. Anybody
His initial research was in the late 80s and the 90s. Yeah, we are indebted to him, and his wife at the time was a gynecologist.
Yeah.
And he would have singers come to him and they would complain about their high notes in the few days before their periods, and he kind of chalked it up to, I don't know, whatever. And his wife said, wait a minute, let's look at this. And so they followed these singers through their cycle, and they did swabs off the larynx and then off the cervix, and they compared the cells, and they found that they were nearly identical. They couldn't even tell the slides apart. The story goes that there was a hormonal cycle in the vocal folds themselves, on the vocal folds. So yeah, that was great research. There are other researchers at the same time, but we are particularly indebted to Abitbol. And I said that not very.
He proved what has been known anecdotally for years, that there are sex cell receptors in the larynx. I mean, certainly professional singers have known this forever, but now we have the evidence, which is terrific. And I just want to say one more thing about information. One thing that I think is wonderful are the blogs and the online sites that have come up for singing teachers to ask questions, to share information. And this is another place where state-of-the-art information can get disseminated. I'm very excited about that as well.
Joanne, go ahead.
Can I just was reminded that when we talk about voice and aging, I think this is, I'll give you my spiel on it. Lots of times the information, even in the pedagogy books or whatever, the information is in the aging voice chapter, so menopause is in the aging voice chapter. And my reaction to that is, it's a semantic thing, I think, because we hear aging and we think aged or geriatric or senescent. And that maybe isn't quite accurate in some women's case. There are women that go into menopause when they're 40, 42, and their bodies are at a different aging status than somebody who is quite late in their 50s. So I think the time that the body goes into menopause is quite a different situation. And also a lot of aging voice, there's a lot on aging voice, but it's more like 60, 65 is what aging means, or aged. So I like to think of middle-age voice, or mid-year, midlife aging versus old aging. So that's my particular spiel about that.
We've got a whole lot of questions, so I'd like to try and get through several of these. So if we can head into that. A couple questions about dryness being a problem for singing, and so just any information you have about dealing with the dryness that comes.
That's a really common question, and we get that on our Facebook page, which we actually didn't talk about, so I'll throw that in. When we started writing the book about a year ago, we decided, let's get a Facebook page going. We couldn't find one that was addressing these things, so we Singing Through Change on Facebook, and we have well over 1,400 people signed on the group, and there are about 75 men, I think. And literally people all over the world are joining us. It's been a really fascinating thing. Maybe you pop in sometimes, don't you? And the questions have taken us places we had no idea that we would go, and we have to go down rabbit holes to either find the information or tell people where to look. Or it's been very, very interesting. Okay, now I've lost the question.
Dryness.
Oh, dryness. Yeah, dryness is so common, and that probably has to do with loss of hormones. The estrogen helps to support, from what I understand, these little secretory glands on the larynx that give us that nice slippery mucus that we want. They stop working as well, possibly due to hormonal change and or aging as time goes on. And it's very frustrating. One study said that they looked at, I forget how many women, but they saw thick, gooky mucus on 99% of these women. So we have to attack, you can drink a lot, that kind of helps, but not exactly. Steam apparently can help, those little handheld nebulizer.
Nebulizer.
Those seem to be the most effective. They last, 20 minutes or so, but that can help. Sucking on things seems to help if you have a dry mouth. There are products called Biotine, they're xylitol based, seem to do better. There are products for people that have dry mouth, but the problem is this down here. It doesn't necessarily get down on the larynx. Peggy, do you have something you want to add?
There's no good answer to it. Yeah, it's two different things. There are dry vocal folds, and there's the dry sensation in the mouth and the throat, and certainly trying to drink more water might be helpful. But again, I would go back to the idea of hormone replacement therapy for anyone in whom it is not counterindicated. I think women should feel free to investigate that. And before your time is up today, maybe to address the concept of thinking about hormone replacement before one even reaches menopause. And the best way to do that would be to have your hormone levels checked before you go into perimenopause, so you'll know what your norm is, and have it checked more than once. This is the advice that physicians or docs, voice docs, are coming up with now. So go to your gynecologist, get your hormone levels checked while your periods are regular, so that when you do go through menopause, you'll know what your levels should be. But I really think, based on sort of anecdotal evidence that I have received from singers, I think hormone replacement therapy is something that serious singers should consider.
And you'll have to,
if there's no.
I would add, you may have to find a doc to work with you, and here in Seattle, naturopathic docs are very well accepted, and they look at numbers differently than your Western med docs, and they may be more willing, and maybe sometimes a combination between both a Western med doc and a naturopathic doc to get some viable information. That's my experience. Peggy, I can tell you.
One thing I would say, yeah, sure. The one thing I would say about that is, if you're going to take hormone replacement therapy, you want hormones that are FDA approved.
Of course.
Because those that are not, you do not know exactly how they may affect you. I would be very, very careful with that.
A lot of women. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and a lot of women are looking at hormones for different reasons, for energy, for sexual drive. They're looking at things that are androgen or testosterone laced, which I would not recommend for singers. But I would just say broadly, based on my experience, that if there's no counterindication, especially related to any form of cancer, that serious singers should consider it. And the question is always, should I start at perimenopause or menopause? You'd have to consult with a gynecologist about this. But if your gynecologist is not knowledgeable, point them in the direction of a voice doc and let them consult.
Right. And there are really good resources out there. The National Menopause Society, North American Menopause Society, has some really good position papers that you can find on their website. We cite this in our book. We have one little page about HT. The scene on this is so different than it was early on in the 2000s. the study that was kind of scary, that got all the news, has been re-examined, more studies have been done, that
Right.
very different viewpoint of that study, and it's not too
Right.
hard to find information on that.
A much safer timeline for the use of hormone replacement is certainly worth considering. I
Right.
strongly recommend it because I
Right.
think it's the only thing we have right now that can work systemically in a positive way, and we know it can. It doesn't work the same for everyone, but I think it's worth a shot if you can do it.
And if you don't like it, you can stop. And the other thing is that women are interested in bioidentical hormones, and that's one reason they might want what are they called? Pharmacy produced ones, creams and stuff. But you don't have, if you want bioidentical, there are FDA approved versions of those, micronized progesterone and estradiol. Those are bioidentical products, and they come in standardized doses. I think that's what you're talking about, Peggy, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's because you've got to know what you're getting. I mean, you really need to know that.
Right.
So another question, did you notice any correlation between easy or difficult childbirth and easy or difficult menopause?
Whoa, I've never even thought about it. We're talking about me personally?
No, just in the stories of people.
Oh, no, we really didn't talk about people's childbirths. So I don't have that information.
Okay.
It's an interesting question.
Find anecdotally that muscle tension dysphonia became a factor with singers during the change due to stress or other reasons?
Now, I can think of one case, but it didn't actually take place in the perimenopausal menopausal transition. It was a little bit later on in the story. I suspect, I don't know, that there was an MTD thing going on, but so no. And the other thing about it, we are in these stories, we're listening to their reports. We have to take their word for what they were going through, and which is part of the, sort of the charm of it in a way, but it also leaves some mysteries. So no, we didn't actually hear about MTD.
Could I contribute one thought on that just very quickly? I think there is a measure of MTD or muscle tension that can accompany any change in the mechanism, because when a change occurs, we look for our technique to try and adjust for it. And if it's a true mechanical difference at the level of the vocal folds, sometimes we make adjustments that are not appropriate, and they end up being a kind of muscle tension that then becomes the problem. I know for a fact that I've seen that through menopausal periods, just as I've seen it with other situations. And I'm sure you have too, Kari, with voices that are going through some sort of problem. So anytime the mechanism is unstable for any reason or different, the potential for muscle tension and then muscle tension dysphonia to occur is present. So that's why singers have to be so careful just to honor their technique through this period of instability, where you feel like you wake up every day with a different animal in your throat.
Would you say that these days MTD is more of a descriptor for compensatory behaviors?
It has many people use it as a diagnosis unto itself. I'm
Right.
a little unclear about that myself, because I feel like I see so much muscle tension that creates or contributes to dysphonia. I would assume that muscle tension dysphonia as a diagnosis would refer to muscle tension that is the primary problem for the dysphonia. But so often muscle tension is triggered by another event. It's a secondary issue that becomes the primary issue. So it's a little bit complicated.
Hard to separate out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. I digress.
I want to talk about just two things. The book itself is written for a general audience. We have, like I said, we had many different kinds of singers, but we're gearing the book for general readers, because we don't assume anything. And so the language is not particularly sophisticated, but we hope the content is, and the sources are solid. And one reason I thought about this later, it's kind of nice to have made that choice, because we hope we'll have readers from other parts of the world reading this. And they're, as English is a second language, it might help. I also wanted to talk about accepting change as we go through, because the voice does change.
Thank you for saying that. Can I just say one thing? I'm just butting in. I can't stand it. You're great. This is perfect. I just want to say one thing. This idea of use it or lose it is not correct. It's use it so you lose it less quickly.
Right.
As we mature, let's don't call it aging, as our body changes, these things are going to change and things are going to get harder and we're going to have to adjust for it and we're going to lose some things that were easy before. And if we accept that, like you're talking about right now from the start, there's so much that singers can bring to the art, even if they've lost some issue, some element of vocal quality or range. There's so many other things that they can bring to the whole art. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, this is, I think the book has these stories in there. One woman in particular, she had her self-concept as a singer was a light soubrette, and her body was changing, her vocal folds were changing, and to superimpose a vocal concept of a lyric soubrette at the age of 45 was not healthy for her. So, you end up, jamming the larynx up, tightening, and eventually she was so uncomfortable, she found a teacher that helped her get out of that mindset, accept a more full, not artificially so, but a warmer, more mature sound, and she was very much more comfortable.
Oh, that's great.
But I call myself a meno soprano. I'm a meno soprano. I used to be a lyric soubrette. I'm not a mezzo really. I just made up my own Fach here. And I think that's not a bad concept to say it's not quite the same. And many women said, when I got through all that, I realized I want to sing because I love it. I'm less interested in impressing people. I accept myself. I accept my warts. And they often do come to a more satisfying singing life. I'm not going to say performing because not everybody's a performer. Moving to a different section in the choir, there's nothing wrong with that. Or some singers, there was a choral director that talked about trans-sectional singers, where like on one piece, sing alto, the next piece, sing second, maybe go down to the tenor. Accommodate, to what's going on with the voice is healthier. In fact, I heard a voice methodology that I will not name, but the source said in their workshop, they're going to have a workshop for women who want to go down to the bass line, not the bass line, but in the bass clef, and help them sing down there comfortably. I thought, well, that's an interesting concept. Whether everybody wants to do that, the point is to do it comfortably and healthily if that's their choice and their voice is leading them that way.
It's about getting joy from singing, from the act of singing. Whether you're singing the Fach you sang when you were 30 or 40, or you're singing a new Fach, it's about that joy.
We had a couple of reports, and one particularly and I have permission from Chris McCafferty, if he's out there. He said that, and he works with a lot of mature singers, and he said that in some cases, when the voice begins to go on the rocks, whatever, that it triggers them. And another voice, actually an SLP friend of mine said this, the same thing. She said that when the Fach starts to tremble a little bit, or vocal identity begins to change, or the voice becomes not familiar, that it sometimes can trigger old vocal insecurities. And you have to look out for that as a teacher to deal with that.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. There's so much identity too with
Absolutely.
our voices. Other questions, Kari? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you're doing great. Yes, lots, and I'm just trying to assess through. I think we've touched a little bit on this one, but maybe I'd like to go a little further. Let me find it again. Lori says, I've ordered the book, but it has not yet arrived. I'm curious as to whether or not you gleaned any information around the emotions women have when their voice changes and the psychological impact of the changing voice, which you were talking a bit about that now, but what other things from your talking to 56 women?
Well, there's that point. I think there might be a little bit of grieving involved if you realize, oh, I'm not a lyric soubrette anymore. Just letting go of that and moving on. And I think we can minimize these things. And if your voice begins to change and you do not understand that it's secondary to hormonal shift, you're apt to blame yourself and feel angry, feel like you can't sing, you never could sing in the first place. These are thoughts that come to your mind. And Martha Elliott's survey really covered that beautifully, because she asked those questions, and you don't see those questions in scientific studies. You get those when you talk to people. The very first story in our book is a woman who felt that same way, and she felt like she couldn't talk to even her singer friends about her feelings about, my voice is letting me down. So if we let people know that they're not making it up, and that they have probably not become a bad singer, I think that helps a lot. Say, oh, my voice is doing interesting things. I need to figure out how to get through this healthily. But and I think that's important to know. So, and there may be some letting go, and that's normal, right? I can't wear a bikini anymore, so never could.
I'm struck by the corollary, as we did a couple of the mental health Nats chats recently with around COVID, and we've tonight also touched on a similar ideas around singer identity, stages of grief, you know, moving into acceptance at some point. Once you've done your grief work, right, you have to do that, and then at some point, for even women going through the change, there comes an arrival of an acceptance, hopefully, and your singer identity adapts and changes so that you can find joy again. You know, I think there's some correlation in all of that. And I think your book will help to validate some of that process for people.
That's what we're hoping.
That there are other women who have experienced, and 56 stories that you've shared. And of course, there are thousands and millions of women around the world who this has not been a subject that's been discussed enough. So
No, it hasn't.
And I wonder too, living in the culture in the United States in which we live, where youth and this myth of perpetual youth being the ultimate holy grail is put upon women 24/7. I mean, it's got to be part of our thinking. You know, we're trying to preserve our bodies in this youthful state, which is ridiculous. You know, and how do we accept the normal transition of our bodies through life and embrace them and let them be the new normal, as you're talking about? And this is all part of that, and we're fighting the culture so hard.
Right. You know, I think that we're at a point that's kind of nice, where certain performing artists are talking about vocal injury now more openly. There was a period like back in the 1990s where Krista Ludwig talked about her issues with her voice in menopause. Shirley Barrett did. We heard anything in the last 20 years or so, except very interesting, Kathy Mattea. So she's kind of I think a folk kind of singer. She's come out recently with some really nice interviews where she talks about having taken off 6 years between albums, and that's where she went through her menopausal change. And even as a popular music artist, she expresses the feelings so beautifully. I recommend particularly the article, and there's an interview on NPR. It's actually cited in the book, where she explains that feeling of not knowing her voice, but going at it. She got back to rehearsing, trying new songs, trying new rep, and finding the good fit. And then she realized, okay, now I can start recording and performing again. And it was a process. I want to throw one thing in that kind of relates, and that's a new identity can open doors to new repertory, new music, new kinds of music making, and sometimes can help us get through a sticky place with the voice. And I have permission to share this story. One woman that I sat across a table at a restaurant with tears pouring down her face, telling me about how bad her voice was feeling, and we were talking about possibly it was hormonal, and you know it was going to be okay in the end. So I knew this woman, and she sang in an open lesson that she had signed up to work with my husband, and so I was in the room just watching. And she said, I want to show you De Vieni non tardar, because it goes right through the middle, Peggy, this middle voice thing, right? And she says, it's so hard for me to go through there. I mean, I'm okay a little bit higher, but through that middle voice, it just feels awful. And she said, I'm going to sing it my classical way, and you can hear it. And then I'm going to sing it my musical theater way. So she did it first with her, her classical technique. And I know what she's feeling. I know that feeling of it.
Yep.
Being able to
Yep.
get through there, and I'm
Mhm.
feeling her pain, and then she said, okay, now I'm going to do my musical theater version. And she sang it. She didn't sing it with musical theater style, but she found a different balance of for the, if you call it upper voice, low voice, mixed registration, whatever. And then she sang through it so much better. And I said, do it that way, because it
Mhm.
doesn't sound not classical. It's just a bit of a shift, recalibration of how she sang.
Yeah, it really is adding a little chest dominant or TA dominant mix. It's a real recipe for sure. That's great. You have other questions, Kari?
Um, it's a little bit, this ties in with what you were just talking about a bit. It's a common somebody states that it's common symptom described as intermittent roughness through registration transitions. Patients have described that it can easily be worked out, but that it's unpredictable, which
Yeah.
leads you, Joanne, to make the point that your book was not about prescribing, for lack of a better words, vocal exercises. It was really about gathering stories of women's experience to help people feel validated in their own personal journey. Correct? We want to make that clear about the book's intent.
We do. Yeah, and we thought about this really carefully. It's like, do we have exercises in the book? Do we have specific guidance about it? And we decided not to, because it's a general audience, and we can't make assumptions about what people would do with a particular exercise. I think it's better to send people to people that can help them, voice teachers, singing voice specialists, SLPs, that can work with voice directly. Though there's certain guidelines that I think we can talk about, but it really depends on what the voice is doing, the person that's standing in front of you, or what they seem to need. So
Yeah.
maybe there's another book, I don't know. And there's certainly good books on working with aging voice, but this, again, we've talked about, this is not exactly an aging voice conundrum.
Right. Anne Ritchie writes in that she found great information to help women understand just how estrogen affects the whole body in the book Outliving Your Ovaries by Marina Johnson. Outliving Your Ovaries by Marina Johnson. I'll just say that again.
Okay, great.
That's one that's familiar to you?
Yeah, I haven't looked at it, but I've seen it.
Yeah. Well, you guys, we're coming at the top of our time, and I want to leave a couple minutes just to discuss that that the three of you, Joanne and Nancy Boss and Cate, will all be speaking at our conference, the NATS conference in June, which is going online, as most people know by now. And so there will be more information following about how to see the various presentations that were slated to be in Knoxville that will now be going online. And so, Joanne, the three of you will be discussing some of this research, correct? On behalf of the Voice Foundation, I just want to say that on May 27th, the 49th Voice Foundation Symposium also will be virtual this year, and there will be no fee, no registration, and it'll stay online for a year. And links to the poster and paper presentations will be sent out and will be found on the Voice Foundation website. So I want to be sure and mention those things. So Joanne, thank you for all this work. And why don't you remind people where they can find the book?
It's on Amazon. You can order a soft cover copy there, also Kindle edition. And there's going to be an Audible edition that Nancy Boss has voiced, and that's going to come out a little bit later. It got delayed, so that'll come out probably in about 3 weeks or so. So thanks for checking it out. Love to have you read it.
And our next NATS chat, regularly scheduled NATS chat, will be with Tom Burke on May 3rd, creating a safe space, and we will discuss insights from motor learning and positive psychology perspective for how to create a safe space for our singers. So I hope you'll join us May 3rd, and you can of course register on nats.org under the NATS chat tab. So thank you ladies so much for joining us. Peggy, thank you as always for your incredible insights and wealth of information and wisdom. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me. And Joanne, thank you, all three of you. Really, I can't thank you enough for what you've done.
It's been a wonderful experience. We're friends forever, I tell you.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, attendees, for joining us tonight, and I hope to see you on our next Nats Chat, the last one of the season in May. Have a great evening.